And now we proceed with the remaining stages of the Renters Reform Bill. Anthony Mangnall.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I rise to speak on the amendments in my name as well as a number of government amendments. And I feel I should start by actually thanking both the Minister and the Shadow Minister for their conversations over the last 5 months on this topic. And I should also be clear about my position in leading a number of amendments on this bill. At no point have we ever sought to stop Section 21 from coming in. In terms of it, and I hope I'll be able to make this clear in the course of my remarks, what we have sought to do is to stop the ending of fixed-term tenancies, something I believe will have a dramatic impact on the supply of properties and long-term rental properties. That, to me, is the concern, and that, to me, will cause far greater upset in the short and long term in ensuring that people can have the houses that they need. From the outset of this bill, delighted to.
I am very grateful to my honourable friend, particularly in rural areas like mine, where the housing is already very expensive. What is going to happen, in fact, and has already been happening, is that more and more landlords will simply think that letting their properties out is not worth the candle. They'll sell them. The effect is there will be fewer and fewer properties to rent. Those that are available will therefore go up and up in price. And our youngsters will struggle then, therefore, to get onto the rental ladder.
The right honourable gentleman for the point that he makes, and it is one that I'm going to come on to, both in terms of the impact that this bill will have on short-term lets and the attractiveness of that, and indeed the bureaucracy and hassle that will arrive from the legislation that I think is being put forward in this bill. As I was saying, from the outset of this bill arriving in Parliament, I've worked to try and ensure that the bill strikes the right balance between tenant and landlord, a balance that would ensure that the rights of tenants are respected and enshrined in legislation, while the rights of landlords, property ownership and contract law are maintained and safeguarded. Failure to strike that balance, I believe, will have a disastrous impact on the private rental market within the United Kingdom, complicating the rental market with onerous requests, bureaucratic measures, additional costs, and the inability to operate your own personal property as an individual might wish will only result in large swathes of the private rented sector throwing up their hands and selling their properties. Just as the same as failure to support tenants will only embolden rogue landlords, diminish standards and increase unfair treatment. It has been my mission from the start, Madam Deputy Speaker, to find a level playing field that ensures both tenant and landlord can cooperate together to provide a fair market that has a healthy supply of rental properties with rights and standards enshrined, with costs low, with bureaucracy minimal, and with a system that respects the rule of law, and perhaps most importantly, has a structure and a court system that is effective and delivers. All of this has been done because we are in the midst of a supply crisis within the private rented sector, something we have yet to touch on. There are an average of 25 prospective tenants inquiring about every available rental property, up from 8 in 2019, according to Rightmove. By the end of 2023, Hamptons estimates that individual landlords would have sold almost 300,000 more homes than they bought since 2016. Last year, the Bank of England warned demand for rental properties continued to outstrip supply as the number of landlords choosing to exit the market increased. It's therefore vital that this bill has the confidence of responsible landlords, that pragmatic changes are being made to the bill. Failure to do so is only going to deepen that crisis. Turning to the amendments, if I may. At the earlier stages, regarding Amendment 6, at the earlier stages of this bill, I remarked that failure to have a sensible period of rental at the start of a tenancy would likely result in the flourishing of long-term rental properties being used as short-term lets. Given the substantial price difference between short-term lets and long-term lets in constituencies such as mine, and indeed as the Honourable Lady has mentioned in Shropshire and in Northumberland, I believe, sorry, I'm going to get the former leader's constituency wrong, there would be a very real likelihood of people exploiting that loophole. Thank you, Cumbria, I apologise. Further to which, landlords incur costs and expenses when entering into a tenancy, and they need some level of certainty of a minimum period. coupled with the fact that many buy-to-let mortgage lenders also require a minimum 6-month tenancy agreement in order to lend to residential landlords. As a result, I tabled Amendment 6 with the support of 58 colleagues to ensure that tenants could not provide 2 months' notice to leave the property until they had resided in it for 4 months. This is in line, I believe, with the recommendations that were made by the Honourable Gentleman's Select Committee. I therefore welcome the fact that the government... can I just finish this point and then, of course, I'll give way? I therefore welcome the fact that the government has accepted this argument and introduced new Clause 15, which mirrors Amendment 6, and I will therefore withdraw my Amendment 6 of the Honourable Gentleman.
I wonder if I could just tease out from the Honourable Gentleman a bit of his reasoning as to why he thinks the possibility of rental properties being used as short-term lets is such a serious one. It's an entirely hypothetical problem. Renters taking out these tenancy agreements will have to provide 5 weeks of deposit. They'll probably be charged the maximum. They have to go through a lengthy process of trying to get those deposit backs. What evidence does he have to suggest that en masse tenants are going to try and game the system in the way that he expects?
Respect to the Honourable Gentleman, I thank him for his interruption. I'm saying that is one of the reasons that I fear not having a minimum notice period, but I would also reflect in constituencies like mine, where we have the highest number of second homes and short-term lets of almost anywhere in the country, and there is such a significant price differential, and there is such a significant amount of hassle that is being heaped on landlords by this bill, that is the way in which it may push people, and that may be one of the foreseen consequences. And I raised this at second reading and indeed have had private conversations with the Honourable Gentleman about it. As I say, Madam Deputy Speaker, I withdraw my Amendment 6. Regarding new Clause 2, on rent repayment orders. This was a new clause that would enable local housing authorities to impose financial penalties on certain individuals when it believes a housing offence has been committed by a body corporate. Last year, the Supreme Court delivered a landmark ruling, and it said that where rent-to-rent companies take over the running of a property, they cannot pass their legal liabilities onto the landlord of the property. The government has amended the bill to reverse this decision. It would mean that landlords could be fined even in cases where rent-to-rent or other similar companies has, without the landlord's knowledge, been asked by tenants to illegally sublet a property. Again, according to data from Direct Line, 1 in 10 renters admit to subletting part of the home they currently live in, of which 48% did not disclose this to their landlords, and 3/4 did not review their existing lease agreements to determine if subletting was permitted before doing so. This amendment would deal with the main concern associated with the use of rent-to-rent companies. It would address the problem of landlords and others who willingly hide behind such companies to let properties while avoiding liability for rent repayment orders without penalising those who are innocent victims of such companies. Again, I welcome and recognise the fact that the government has seen sense to table their own amendment, mirroring my Clause 2 in the form of new Clause 34. And, Madam Deputy Speaker, I therefore withdraw my new Clause 2, if I am permitted to do so. Regarding Amendment 9 and 8, under my name, on court reform, as has been discussed already, the amendment will require the Secretary of State to publish a review of the operation of residential possession proceedings before determining the commencement date for the provision of Chapter 1 of Part 1. Reforms to the justice system are, of course, vital for tenants and landlords to be able to enforce their rights when Section 21 is rightly ended. The Law Societies warn that courts are vastly overstretched. Possession claims and the eviction process can take many months, sometimes more. It continues. This bill, may lead to an increase in contested hearings in the short term, as landlords that would previously have used no-fault provisions will instead have to prove fault. The government must outline how it intends to manage increased demands on court and what additional resourcing it will put in place to deal with existing backlogs. Again, data from the Ministry of Justice shows that it takes a mean average of almost 29 weeks between a private landlord making a legitimate possession claim and the repossession actually happening under Section 8 procedure. The Ministry of Justice notes that timeliness figures are higher than the legal guidelines, and it's not acceptable that where tenants are committing antisocial behaviour, fellow tenants and neighbours are expected to wait over half a year before the problem is resolved. Please.
Does he accept it? I said in my opening speech, we are exploring expediting possession for serious antisocial behaviour claims. I'm happy to work with him on how we get that and ensure that it happens before these reforms are fully implemented.
Minister's intervention, and I think he'll find this as the part of my speech where we'll be agreeing vehemently, and the latter part of the speech might not be so agreeable, but I thank him for that intervention, and I always welcome the opportunity to work with him on this. Likewise, in the case of rent arrears, it cannot be acceptable to have a system that allows rent arrears to continue to build for 7 months. The amendment under my name would make good on the government's commitment that the justice system is fully prepared for the impact of the end of Section 21 before it goes on. Again, I'm grateful to the government that it's decided to accept this point in principle and introduce Government New Clause 30, which mirrors my amendment supported by so many colleagues here, Amendment 9. So I therefore withdraw my Amendment 9. With regards to New Clause 1, the repeal of requirement for selective licensing, the new clause that I put under my name would remove the ability of local housing authorities to designate areas as subject to selective licensing. Now, the bill provides a Secretary of State with the power to develop a new property portal that all landlords would have to join to demonstrate to prospective tenants that the properties they rent meet all required standards. It would be effectively a national licensing scheme. As selective licensing deals with only management quality and not property standards, the changes in the bill are likely to do more than the selective licensing to improve properties. And since councils will be able to use the portal access, information on all private rented properties and landlords operating in their area, and in the view of plans for a decent home standard for the sector, local selective licensing schemes will be made redundant. In Wales, the introduction of landlord registration led to the ending of almost all selective licensing, and it is unlikely that local authorities would pursue costly and complex schemes in the future anyway. And I do take on board the comments the Honourable Gentleman made the Minister made in his opening remarks. Selective licensing is an additional cost to landlords, which will now be further added to the property portal and redress scheme, and they should not have to be regulated twice and pay twice for much the same thing. This amendment, my amendment, would scrap selective licensing for schemes for private rented housing when the property portal goes live. Having both would not enhance protections for tenants, but merely be a duplication. Scrapping them would be an unnecessary layer of bureaucracy and a cost for landlords. But again, I am grateful for the opening remarks of the Minister, and I will take the government at its word on the dispatch box about conducting a review of selective licensing at its earliest opportunity. My new clause 3 around antisocial behaviour. This would be a clause that enables courts to consider hearsay evidence during the course of proceedings for possession on the grounds of antisocial behaviour. It is, of course, vital that when Section 21 ends, swift and effective action can be taken against those tenants committing antisocial behaviour who cause misery for so many neighbours and fellow tenants. To support this, the government has changed the wording in the discretionary grounds to repossess a property due to tenant antisocial behaviour under ground 14. It clarifies that any behaviour capable of causing nuisance or annoyance can lead to eviction. Previously, it was behaviour likely to cause a problem. However, in my mind, this is not the true problem. The problem currently, which is not dealt with by the bill, is that the main evidence of nuisance is proved by neighbours as they are the closest person involved. The changes to the definition of nuisance do not change the fact that evidence of behaviour needs to be provided, and that will still come from neighbours. They are, however, in so many instances reluctant to attend and give evidence, in part because of the slow speed of the court system will mean that they'll be forced to live near the person that they have helped evict for several months afterwards or reported. A better solution, in my mind, would be to allow landlords to use evidence of problematic behaviour that is provided by neighbours complaining by text or email to the landlord or their letting agency. This evidence is not currently admissible, and the courts cannot give sufficient weight to it when deciding if a tenant is committing antisocial behaviour. This amendment would allow for such evidence to be used by the courts. Now, in the negotiations and discussions that we had in the run-up to this moment, the Minister's Department and his civil service team were extremely helpful in highlighting the civil procedure rules, part 33.3, in relation to circumstance in which notice of intention to rely on hearsay evidence is not required. And again, the comments made by the Minister are somewhat welcome, although I hope his department will be able to follow up to the Department of Justice, and so I therefore withdraw new clause 3. Amendment 5 on houses of multiple occupancies relating specifically to students. This again was an amendment that the ground for possession for student properties could also be used for properties occupied just by 1 or 2 students, which would not otherwise have been considered as HMOs. Ending fixed-term tenancies would be problematic for the student housing market. It would be problematic for the whole bill, which operates on a yearly cycle for one academic year to another. Whilst the government has recognised this by allowing fixed-term agreements to continue in purpose-built student accommodation, it will not apply, as I understand it, to traditional off-street private rented housing, often rented to those in their 2nd or 3rd year of studies. This is a concern shared by much of the industry and indeed by the Honourable Gentleman's Select Committee, which noted currently the proposal is to include that this part of the PRS in the tenancy reform, but we conclude that abolishing fixed-term contracts here could make lettings to students considerably less attractive to private landlords, as the student market mirrors the academic year and benefits greatly from 12-month fixed tenancies. I hope I've quoted the Honourable Gentleman's report accurately. A government amendment to the bill, made at committee stages in the Commons, establishes a new ground for possessions, ground 4A, to protect the student housing market. This is to be welcomed. It will ensure that landlords can guarantee that most student properties will be available for each academic year. However, it will not protect all student housing. However, the new grounds will only cover houses of multiple occupation. It will not apply to the 2-person student properties and those lived in by a single student. This is an oversight that will be rectified with my proposed amendment, and again I thank the government for recognising this and introducing their own amendments in the form of 226 and 228, which have addressed that problem, and I am grateful. Madam Deputy Speaker, as I come to my concluding remarks at last, I would like to make some comment on Amendment 10 that was not selected, which is...
Order. I've been listening carefully to what the Honourable Gentleman has been saying, and he has a range of amendments, and it's perfectly in order for him to speak to those, but it's not in order for him to speak to Amendment 10 because it has not been selected. Not only not selected for a division, but it has not been selected for debate. There might well be a general point to which he could make reference, which might address a general point, but he may not speak to Amendment 10. Mr. Mangnall.
Speaker, for being so generous in your explanation on that, and I thank. The purpose and problems that I see with this bill is that while the intent to remove Section 21 is a good one, and it is a necessary one, and yes, it has taken time to get to this point, it is not one that those who have signed my amendments has ever objected to. The point and principle of why these amendments have been so widely supported is that there must be some leeway around ensuring that fixed-term tenancies can remain. Indeed, they still remain in certain instances within the student market. And that is... Yes, I will. Thank you.
He's made a very powerful speech. Does he agree with me that it's in renters' interest more than anything else to be able to agree longer-term tenancies than potentially just 6 months in order to have their own security of tenure? If you have a young family, you absolutely do not want some of those grounds, like sale, to come in the way of these things.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his intervention. He is absolutely right to make this point, because in its essence what this bill is doing, it is removing and forbidding a contract being agreed with a date at which point the tenant would have to leave the property. I might just also give reference to the comments of the noble Lord Hannanan of Kingsclere, who pointed out in February in the other place, that language matters in politics and tendentious phraseology has consequences. How is it that we have reached the point where the expiry of a contract freely entered into by 2 parties at the end of its term is now widely referred to as an eviction, let alone a no-fault eviction? To be clear, this bill is going to make it illegal to sign a fixed-term tenancy. And the lack of clarity when describing the end of a contract has meant that we are now terming simple cessations of contracts as no-fault evictions. Can I just finish a point, and of course I'll give way? Well, who is at fault when a previously agreed contract comes to an end at a future date? No one. I do believe that you can retain fixed-term tenancies and scrap Section 21, and that there are ways to go through in doing this. The Honourable Lady.
Grateful to him for giving way. I just wonder if he would concede the point that although in principle it is perfectly possible to imagine a scenario where the tenant and the landlord mutually agree to a new set length of tenancy, in actual fact the reality is exactly because so many tenants are rushing for so few properties, the amount of free will there is on the behalf of the tenant in signing up to that contract is actually not very much. And so this idea of it being mutually agreeable, I think, is rather more suspect than he suggests.
I actually come at that position from a different angle, which is that because we are heaping so many rules and regulations and making it so difficult that people are leaving the market as a result. This was one of the pioneering policies of Thatcher that brought in the idea of the free market around property and ensured that millions of people across this country could play a social value in having a buy-to-let property on a long-term basis. Now, the Honourable Lady won't agree with me. I don't think we agree on very much. I'm okay, but it's good to be able to debate this, especially in this chamber. But I think we must be honest about this. The consequences of removing fixed-term tenancies is essentially the state turning around and saying to individuals what they can or cannot do with their own private properties. It does not give landlords, it is susceptible to remove Section 21 as well as retaining fixed-term tenancies. I have said, Mr. Deputy Speaker, that we have long prided ourselves on this side of the House as the party of free markets, and we should keep that in our minds when we vote later on today. It is. Can I just finish this point and then I'll give way? We are sending completely the wrong message with dire consequences for future levels of housing supply. We are making an enormous mistake which will reduce long-term lets in favour of short-term lets and result in many properties being taken off the rental market. I would hate to be back here to have to repeat the figures that I did at the start of my remarks, where in 2019 it was 8 people for every 1 property, and now it is 25, to say that that number is going up and up. But I fear that as a consequence of this bill, that is going to happen. The Honourable Gentleman.
Honourable Gentleman. He seems to be saying he's in favour of abolishing Section 21, but then giving landlords the right to bring in fixed-term tenancies, which end with a Section 21 notice. And if the landlord chooses, therefore, Section 21 won't be abolished, will it? It is something that will be a figment of our imagination here, because in practice it would never be delivered with his proposal.
That point, and he's absolutely right to make it, and he has far greater expertise in this area than I do. But I am saying you can retain fixed-term tenancies and you can scrap Section 21 and amend other parts of this bill. Breach of contract. Indeed, you could make notice periods longer. In fact, I know that the department even discussed this idea when this was mooted after the 2019 election, which was rather than you could scrap Section 21, but you could increase the notice period for an eviction. These are ways in which you could do it. But I think to throw the baby out with the bathwater and become so restrictive on someone's private property is a problem. People go into the buy-to-let market to let their property out. And unfortunately, I think the consequence again is that this will have the opposite impact. It will push people out of the market who will no longer want to deal with a hassle. Yes.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. I think one of the challenges here, and he's making a fantastic speech, and I commend him for all of his efforts in relation to this bill, is that sometimes thinking about this is very constrained to, for example, a metropolitan area. We both represent rural constituencies really affected by short-term holiday lets. And the unintended consequence of this bill is that landlords will be pushed towards using them because the rules and regulations become quite so tight and constrained on long-term landlords. Does he not agree?
The Honourable Gentleman is absolutely right to raise that, and it comes back to this point of where we are in terms of trying to incentivise long-term lets over short-term lets. And again, in rural constituencies in the southwest, we have faced this issue of the rising tide of short-term lets. However, we are not legislating today on the basis of our own respective constituencies, but the nationwide approach. And we should look very carefully at other countries and other examples of where things have gone so badly wrong by sometimes the simplest tinkering of housing legislation. Scotland on rent controls might be one. Finland or Berlin might be another. These are examples of where we have got things horribly wrong. And this, yes, of course I will.
Just listening very carefully to an excellent contribution, as always. They are lucky to have him in Totnes. Just further to the intervention from my honourable friend from the Cotswolds, is he saying then that the irony of this debate is that we are effectively legislating to no-fault evict tenants because we are pushing landlords out of the market by this legislation? And could he back that up with any more evidence that he's heard in the deliberations he's made in creating this excellent speech?
I understand that. Yes, I think he's absolutely right. What we have seen is, especially and I will use my constituency example, I have seen a significant decline in the number of long-term lets over the last 4-year period, going straight into short-term lets at a far greater cost as well, making it totally unaffordable and relying on us to have to come up with some pretty innovative ways of actually being able to supply the correct amount of rental properties for people who live and work in South Devon. And I think that is something reflected in East Devon and indeed out in Yeovil as well in Somerset and I'm sure in the Cotswolds. Mr Deputy Speaker, I will finish on the basis that I am grateful for the work the department has done on this. At no time do I think that the government has dragged its feet. At no time do I think that they have tried to block me. I have, by the nature of putting in quite so many amendments, I am probably responsible for some of that hold-up, and for that I apologise. But ultimately, this comes down to a belief in whether or not I think we are overreaching, and I feel that this bill is overreaching. There are ways in which we can help ensure the rights of tenants and landlords are enshrined and balanced, but ultimately removing fixed-term tenancies for me is a step that is too far and will be significantly negative for the future rental market. And I will unfortunately have to vote against the bill in third reading.